Today we are going to be reviewing how to factor to solve. So when we have a quadratic, so remember a quadratic means that there's a squared term in the equation. One way for us to solve this is by factoring. So as long as we have all terms to one side, so it equals 0, then we're going to have the skills in order to solve. So notice the directions say solve the following equations. My first example here says 5x squared minus 25x equals 0. So everything is to one side, it equals 0. It's already set up for how we want it. We want to try to factor. Remember, the very first thing you should be thinking about when you're factoring is looking for a GCF. Notice that I see two numbers, a 5 and a 25. Since 5 is smaller, my goal is to figure out if I can get a 5 out of both of these. Well, notice that 25 is 5 times 5. So both of these terms have a number in common. They have a GCF. I can factor that out. Notice that both of these terms also contain a variable. They both have an x. So when you're looking at your x's, you have to take the smaller exponent out. The first term has an x to the second power. That second x really has an exponent of 1. 1 is smaller than 2, so I can only take out 1. So once I factored out that GCF, I want to put whatever's left over. In the first term, 5x squared, I already took out the 5, and x squared, I took out 1x, I'm left with an x. I'm going to bring down that subtraction sign. 25 was 5 times 5. I took out one of the 5's, which means I'm still left with a 5. The x got taken out, so now there's no more variables, and so I close the parentheses. This still equals 0. And now that we've factored completely, we're back to what we did yesterday. I'm going to take both of these factored terms that have an x, and so this first term, even though it's not in parentheses, there's an x with it, I get to take 5x, and I get to set that equal to 0 so I can solve for x. Then I get to take the second term, which this time it's in parentheses, it has a variable, x minus 5 equals 0. All right, so now I can solve for these two equations. I'm going to want to get the x by itself. Well, 5 is attached through multiplication, so I get to divide the 5. That gets me x by itself. 0 divided by 5 is 0. So x equals 0 is one of my solutions. The other equation, I need to move that 5 by adding it. That gets me x by itself, and 0 plus 5 is 5. So my two solutions are 0 and 5. Because remember, if it x squared, that exponent of 2 tells us we should have two answers. Looking at the second problem, x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. Once again, everything is already to one side. It equals 0, so we're good to go there. Now we just have to think about factoring. Well, if I look at those three terms, I don't see a number that they all have in common, because the moment I see that technically there's a 1, I'm not going to be able to take out any numbers. If I look at all of the terms, I don't see a variable in every term. The 3 doesn't have an x, so there is no GCF, which means that my next step in order to factor is to look at that last number. Because there's no number in front of the x squared, I'm just asking myself what multiplies to this 3 but adds to the negative 4. I get to create two parentheses. This still equals 0 though. Because it's only x squared to start us off, that means that x times x is going to start my parentheses. So what multiplies to a positive but adds to a negative? Well, there's two ways to multiply to a positive times a positive, but adding two positives won't get me a negative. So the other option is going to be a negative times a negative. The nice thing about this is that there's only one way to multiply to 3, 3 times 1. So now that I've factored everything, I get to set each of those factors equal to 0. So x minus 3 equals 0 and x minus 1 equals 0. So to get that 3 away from the x, I'm going to have to add it. 0 plus 3 is 3, so x equals 3 is one of my solutions. To move the 1, I'm going to have to add it. That gets me x by itself. 0 plus 1 is 1. And there is my second solution. If I look at this third example, everything's to one side equals 0. So that tells us, okay, now I can start trying to factor. Once again, if they don't have a number or a variable in common, there's no GCF. They don't have a number because, once again, the first number is a 1. And the moment I see a 1, I can't take out any numbers. And they don't all have an x. So there is no GCF. So what multiplies to the last number but adds to the number in the middle? And because there is no number in front of the x, I know that each of my factors are just going to start with an x. Because it has to multiply to a negative, that means one of my parentheses has to have a negative sign and one of them has to have a positive. So now what multiplies to 48? There are quite a few numbers, but I need to have two numbers that are a difference of 2. Well, 8 and 6. 8 times 6 multiplies to 48. So now my goal is just to figure out which one of those has to be positive and which one has to be negative. Well, notice that negative 8 plus 6 is going to get us that negative 2 in the middle. And once again, negative 8 times 6 would get me that negative 48. So I want the 6 to be positive, the 8 to be negative. And now that I've factored, I'm going to set each factor equal to 0 to finish solving the equation. So to get the 6 to the other side, I'm going to have to subtract it. 0 minus 6 is going to give us negative 6. There's one solution. To move the 8 to the other side, I'm going to have to add it. 0 plus 8 is going to give me 8. And there are my two answers. Last problem here, x squared plus x equals 30. Notice that since it equals 30, it does not have it in the form where I can already start factoring. It has to equal 0 in order to make that happen. So how do I move the 30 to the other side? I'm going to subtract it. Because 30 minus 30 is 0, now I will have on the right-hand side it equaling 0. By moving the 30 over to the left-hand side, none of those terms are like terms. So that means that I can't combine anything. And so now I just have x squared plus x minus 30 equals 0. Now it's in the form for us to start factoring. I don't have any numbers or variables in common, so there is no GCF. Once again, there's a 1 in front of the x squared, so that tells me that I'm going to start each of my parentheses with an x. There is a 1 in front of that x, so I'm asking myself what multiplies to negative 30 but adds to positive 1. So because it has to multiply to a negative, one of my numbers has to be positive and one of them has to be negative. There are quite a few numbers that multiply to 30, but I want them to be one apart from each other. Well, 5 times 6. 5 times 6 multiplies to get you 30. But remember, one of these has to be a negative in order for it to multiply to a negative. I need it to add to positive 1. Well, if 6 is positive and 5 is negative, 6 minus 5 will get me that positive 1. So notice that 6 times negative 5 gives me negative 30. So I want the 6 to be positive, the 5 to be negative. Now that I've factored, I'm going to set each factor equal to 0 to finish solving for x. So I'm going to subtract the 6 to get the x by itself. 0 minus 6 is negative 6, and that's one of my answers. To move the 5, I'm going to add it. And 0 plus 5 is 5. And there are my two solutions.